There is something you do every single night that nobody has ever told you matters for your heart. Not your cardiologist, not your internist, not the specialist who reviewed your last echocardiogram. You spend somewhere between a quarter and a third of your entire life doing it. And in all the conversations about diet, about exercise, about medication compliance and blood pressure management, this particular factor almost never comes up. It is your sleep position. And after 60, the direction your body faces during those 7 or 8 hours of horizontal time has physiological consequences that the research is now making increasingly difficult to ignore. For most of medical history, how you slept was considered a comfort matter. Doctors and patients alike treated it as a personal preference, something you sorted out with pillows and mattress firmness and whatever felt right. The assumption was that the body was essentially passive during sleep, resting, offline, not doing much of anything that required optimization. What 3 decades of clinical practice and the last 20 years of cardiovascular and neurological research have collectively revealed is that this assumption was profoundly wrong. Sleep is not passive. It is one of the most metabolically active, physiologically complex periods in the entire 24-hour cycle. Your heart rate shifts across different sleep stages. Your blood pressure moves through patterns that have direct implications for long-term arterial health. Your blood itself, its flow, its distribution, its tendency toward movement or stagnation, behaves differently depending on how your body is positioned against gravity. And after 60, when the cardiovascular system has less reserve capacity and less physiological flexibility than it did in earlier decades, those differences are not trivial. I spent the majority of my surgical career focused on what happens in the operating room. Open heart procedures, bypass grafts, valve reconstructions, the interventional side of cardiac medicine, where you're solving problems that have already fully developed. What shifted my attention toward prevention was a question I found myself returning to with increasing frequency. What happened in the years, sometimes the decades, before these patients arrived on my table? What were the small, accumulated stresses that the heart absorbed quietly over time, below the threshold of symptoms, until finally something gave way? Small habits, repeated thousands of times, add up in ways that medicine often doesn't adequately account for. And very few habits are more consistently repeated than the position in which a person sleeps every night of their life. Here is the foundational anatomical reality that everything else in this conversation rests on. Your heart is not positioned at the center of your chest. It sits offset, angled toward the left side of your body. Roughly 2/3 of its total mass lies on the left side. This is simply how human anatomy is arranged. Now consider what that means when you introduce gravity into the equation by lying down. When you sleep on your left side, the weight and orientation of the heart works in alignment with gravity. The mechanical load on the heart muscle is reduced. It doesn't have to work against the same resistance to push blood out into circulation. Think about carrying something heavy, the same object, the same distance, but once uphill and once downhill. The effort required is fundamentally different even though nothing about the object or the distance has changed. Your heart pumps approximately 100,000 times every single day. It does this without pause, without rest in the conventional sense for your entire life. Any consistent reduction in the mechanical effort required to complete each of those 100,000 cycles accumulates into something meaningful over months and years. After 60, when the heart muscle may carry some degree of age-related stiffness, when the arterial walls have lost some of their youthful elasticity, when the efficiency of the entire system has modestly declined from its earlier peak, mechanical support during the hours designated for recovery is not a small thing. It is precisely the kind of compound advantage that preventive medicine looks for. Sleeping on the right side does not necessarily cause acute harm to a healthy person, but it provides none of the gravitational assistance that the left side position offers. The choice, when you understand the anatomy, is not between two equally neutral options. Now to a structure that most people have never heard of, and that I would argue deserves far more attention in conversations about cardiovascular health after 60. The inferior vena cava is a large vein, one of the largest in the entire body, responsible for carrying deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body back to the right side of the heart. Everything from your legs, your pelvis, your lower abdominal organs. All of that blood makes its return journey through this single vessel. Its function is fundamental to circulatory efficiency, and its anatomical position is the critical detail. The inferior vena cava runs along the right side of the spinal column. When you sleep on your right side, the weight of your internal organs, the liver, the intestines, the accumulated mass of abdominal tissue, presses against the right side of the body where that vein is located. The compression is not total. It is not a complete obstruction. But partial, consistent compression over 7 or 8 hours of sleep is enough to reduce the efficiency of venous return, the rate at which blood flows back toward the heart. Reduced venous return means the heart receives blood less steadily, and it must work harder to compensate for that reduced and irregular supply. When you sleep on your left side, that compression is entirely absent. The inferior vena cava runs without restriction. Blood moves back toward the heart more freely, more consistently, with less turbulence. The heart receives a steadier supply and operates more efficiently during the period when it is meant to be recovering. This matters specifically for people over 60 because venous return becomes a more important and more vulnerable variable with age. The veins themselves lose elasticity over time. The venous valves, the small one-way structures that help push blood upward against gravity, become slightly less effective. The system has less built-in redundancy. Removing any additional obstacle to venous return during the hours of sleep is not a minor adjustment. It is supporting a system that is already working harder than it was 20 years ago. Let me address blood clots directly, because in my experience as a cardiac surgeon, the clots that cause the most devastating outcomes are the ones that arrive without warning. Patients who went to sleep feeling essentially well. No dramatic symptoms in the preceding days. Just a gradual, quiet accumulation of risk that reached a threshold while they were horizontal in the dark. Blood clots form under 3 primary conditions: blood that moves too slowly, blood that pools in one location, and blood that encounters damaged or inflamed vessel walls. That slow movement, stasis, in the clinical language, is not only a risk on long airplane flights or during post-surgical immobility. It happens every night in the veins of your legs and pelvis when circulation is not being adequately supported during sleep. For people over 60, this risk increases for reasons that compound one another. Circulation slows as a natural consequence of aging. Vein walls lose compliance. Blood viscosity can shift, particularly in people taking certain common medications or in people who don't consume adequate fluids during the day. The overnight period, which should be a time of physiological recovery, can instead become a period of cumulative circulatory stagnation if sleep position is working against efficient blood movement. Left side sleeping, by removing compression from the inferior vena cava and supporting better venous return, encourages blood to keep moving through the deep veins. Moving blood is physiologically healthy blood. Stagnant blood is precisely the environment in which clots begin to form. No single postural habit eliminates clot risk entirely. The factors involved are numerous and interconnected, but consistently supporting your circulation during the hours of sleep is a legitimate component of a prevention strategy. After 60, the case for assembling every legitimate component of that strategy is compelling. There is a system in the brain that most people have never heard of, and it has direct implications for both neurological and cardiovascular health that are only beginning to be fully understood. The glymphatic system is the brain's dedicated waste clearance mechanism, a network of channels through which cerebrospinal fluid flows during sleep, flushing metabolic debris that has accumulated during waking hours. Proteins, inflammatory molecules, byproducts of a full day of neural activity, all of it requires clearance. The brain cannot do this efficiently while it is awake and active. The clearance process is overwhelmingly a function of sleep. 2 specific proteins that this system works to remove during sleep have become central to the research on cognitive decline. One is amyloid beta. The other is tau protein. These are the same materials found accumulated in elevated concentrations in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. Their connection to cognitive decline is among the most consistently replicated findings in neuroscience over the past 2 decades. What the research has more recently begun to show is that the glymphatic system does not operate equally in all sleep positions. Side sleeping, as opposed to back or stomach sleeping, appears to enhance the efficiency of glymphatic drainage. And within side sleeping positions, the left side appears to offer a further advantage based on the directional architecture of the brain's internal drainage pathways. Why does this belong in conversation about heart health? Because the brain and the cardiovascular system are physiologically inseparable in their function and their vulnerabilities. Vascular inflammation in the brain elevates stroke risk. Small vessel disease in the brain accelerates cognitive decline and simultaneously reflects the state of vascular health throughout the body. Protecting the brain's clearance function during sleep is not a separate project from protecting cardiovascular health. They are aspects of the same biological system, sharing the same circulatory infrastructure, accumulating damage from the same sources. After 60, what supports one consistently tends to support the other. The connection between sleep position and gastric reflux may seem distant from cardiac surgery, but it is a link with real mechanistic grounding that deserves explicit attention. A substantial proportion of people over 60 experience gastroesophageal reflux, nighttime acid exposure that ranges from mild occasional discomfort to chronic inflammation affecting the esophageal. Many women encountered left side sleep positioning during pregnancy, when it is routinely recommended in the 3rd trimester to optimize blood flow to the placenta through the inferior vena cava. The physiology is the same. Left side positioning removes compression from that major vein and supports venous return. Some women who practiced this positioning during pregnancy carried the habit forward. Many gradually drifted back to previous patterns over the years following delivery. If left side sleeping was ever part of your practice, the body already has a reference point for it. The adaptation back is generally smoother than building the habit from the beginning. For side sleeping in general, particularly for people with joint sensitivity or hip discomfort, a pillow placed between the knees makes a substantial difference. It keeps the hips stacked in neutral alignment, removes lateral pressure from the lower spine, and eliminates most of the musculoskeletal discomfort that prevents people from maintaining the position through the night. A second pillow or a body pillow placed firmly behind the back reduces unconscious rolling during sleep without requiring any active effort to maintain position. The adaptation timeline for changing a sleep position is shorter than most people expect. Within a week, the new position begins to feel less deliberate. Within a month, the majority of people who make a consistent effort report that it has become their natural resting orientation without requiring conscious thought. The body adapts readily to positional habits. It is simply a matter of providing a gentle, consistent guide toward the better option long enough for the pattern to establish itself. 3 decades of cardiac surgery has given me a particular perspective on where damage comes from. The most dramatic cases, the acute events, the emergency interventions, occupy a smaller proportion of the real story than most people imagine. The larger story is written slowly. It is written in years of nights when the circulatory system was working against unnecessary resistance. In years of overnight blood pressure that never fully dipped because the stress response never fully quieted. In years of accumulated vascular inflammation from acid irritating a nerve that regulates the heartbeat. In years of blood moving just a little less efficiently than it should have through veins whose compression nobody thought to consider. None of those things announce themselves. None of them feel like anything at the time. They are quiet, cumulative, invisible until they aren't. And that is precisely what makes them worth paying attention to before they become something that requires a surgeon's intervention rather than a simple, costless adjustment to which direction you face when you close your eyes at night. Your heart has been working without pause for every minute of your life. It has managed every stress, every demand, Every physiological challenge your life is placed on it, without a single day off. The very least the remaining years can offer it is the mechanical advantage of a position that lets it do that work just a little more easily. Every night for free, starting tonight.